Okay, so welcome to this small internal presentation. Feel free to ask questions as we go, or we can do them at the end. It's fine either way. So the goal of this talk is basically for everyone to understand the state of our code base and why do we have so much inconsistency between files, while some view code is Flux and the other is UX, and the reason why we documented the patterns that we have documented. So about, I think it was over 2.5 years ago, everything used to be in Rails and CoffeeScript, which is pretty normal for a Rails code base that was created like three years ago. And then it was very, very hard to hire people that knew CoffeeScript or were willing to work with CoffeeScript. So there was a script, and in one weekend, we went from everything CoffeeScript to jQuery, and the code, by the end of that, the code was very, very ugly. So it was hard to maintain that code. So on top of that, we added Webpack, we added Babel to allow us to do ECMAScript 6, but because we didn't ever stop writing new code for deliverables, so basically we added Webpack, but our code was all still on the window object, so we didn't use code split right away. And then on top of that, we added the linters, we added the slints, and when we did that, every single file would have all the rules disabled, because then again, we didn't stop to writing new code for shipping deliverables. It was something that we did step by step, file by file, mostly on our free time. So at that time, we also moved from NPM to Yarn. And then on top of that, because it was very, very hard to do things like the issue boards or having code in real time with jQuery, we decided to add Vue. And at the time that we decided to add Vue, our plan in the beginning was not to have Vue everywhere, which in retrospective doesn't sound very smart. But basically the goal was to just have all the features that would have real time or a lot of user interactions. Then we would have Vue. Other than that, we would just keep doing things in YAML. So when we started adding Vue, after like 3 or 4 features, we would have, I think we had like 3 or 4 different architectures for our Vue code. So at the time, we documented this pattern, which is basically a Flux-like pattern, where the main components access the service, and the service is basically what we know today as actions. It's a class that will make calls to the API, and then the main component would tell the store to store the data. So this is basically what our architecture used to look like. We would have an YAML file because of the routing, which is still done by Rails. The endpoints and things that we only have access in Rails would be provided through the data attributes to the JavaScript in our bundle file. And then we would mount the main components. And the main component would talk to the service and ask for data, and then tell the store to store the data. And then the small components, all the child components, what we know as dumb components, would not know about the store or the service. Just data goes down and events go up, which is basically what is documented in the official Vue documentation. But we didn't have time to refactor everything. So this is the commits page, the pipelines page. And if you inspect, and you will see this in several different pages, you will have more than one Vue application mounted. So in this specific case, we didn't have time to move everything to an endpoint, and sometimes we also didn't find that it would be that useful for the user to have everything. So it wouldn't make sense to have one or two developers refactoring everything. So in this case, for example, in this pipeline page, we have to view applications. Now we have more, we have the security reports. And in this specific case, these two view applications are sharing the same data and the same endpoints. And it would be very costly to maintain the architecture I just showed you with two view applications pulling the same endpoint every 7 seconds. So for these scenarios, and this still exists in our code base, we have a mediator pattern, which is basically the same as before. Instead, our main view app, it's not a view app, is a mediator class. And none of our main view apps actually talk to the service or the store. Just the data is provided down through the mediator. So this was very hard to maintain. It was not easy to manage complex states. And at the time when we started, there was no Vuex. And then as Vuex got a little bit more stable, then we decided to add Vuex into our code base. And after 2 or 3 features with Vuex, what happened was we had 2 or 3 ways of doing Vuex. So we would have mutations being called right from the components. We would have different ways of dispatching actions, different ways of separating the concerns. So we decided we needed to document a pattern. And the reason behind the pattern we have today and the inspiration is mostly Redux, because you can literally, if you are familiar with React and Redux, you know that you have one way of doing things. And with Vuex, you can have several ways of doing things. And it will still work, but it might not be as maintainable as we wanted it to. So we decided to go with the separation of concerns of everything. So if you are new to Vuex, if you're just here for like 1 month, or if you didn't have the time to go through the docs, this will explain a bit of our documentation. So we have a state, we have getters, mutations, actions, and modules. And our goal is to have a flow that represents a user flow. So when a user clicks on something, that will basically dispatch an action, and that action will commit a mutation that will change the state. So we decided that every file, every concern should be in each file, because it's a lot easier to read, and it's also a lot easier. Well, they are a lot smaller if we split them into several files. So our main index file, we create a store. You may see that this is what we have documented, that we export the instantiated store. It does not work sometimes when we need the same store in several applications. For example, when we added the dropdown for the projects and groups that we have in the main bar, we were exporting the store like this and using it for projects and groups in the same page, and that did not work. So we had to change the documented way of doing that. Our state file is a function that exports an object, and the reason why it exports, it's a function and not an object directly, is because often in tests we change the state directly, and then we need to keep cleaning it. This way we are sure that we are always exporting a new object. So actions are a payload of information that send data to our application. And usually they have a type and they have the payload itself that basically it describes what happens. And enforcing our goal with this pattern is enforcing that every change is described as an action in a human way. So we have this pattern that you've seen documented and you've seen in reviews, that we have a request and receive namespace, and then we have a fetch namespace. And the goal with this is that our component only knows about the fetch action. And the reason for this is because sometimes we would go into our view applications and we would have the loading state being toggled somewhere in the component, and we wouldn't actually know why. Sometimes in the created method, we would have an action that would toggle the state to true without even the request being started. So although this is not very Vuex-like according to the docs, it's a lot more inspired in the Redux ones, with the action creators. And although this means a lot more boilerplate, it's useful that you go into any application and everything is the same. You are expecting this pattern in every single of our Vue applications. So basically, the fetch namespace will be responsible to call the request users. And we know that when a request is made, we usually toggle the loading state to true. And then when we receive the request again, if it's a success response, then we will have to toggle the loading state to false, and we will set the data. And the same for the error one, except that we will set an error. So for us, the front-end team is easier to understand exactly why the state is being changed. So the mutations are basically how the state changes. And well, I literally copied our documentation into this slide, to these slides. And I told you before when I started explaining the architecture that sometimes we would have mutations being dispatched from the components, which we should not have that. Otherwise, we kind of miss the flux flow of one single direction. So this is what our mutations look like. The request toggles the loading to true, the receive toggles it back to false, and it's easy to understand what is happening. And usually the data transformation that we need, we usually do that in the mutations itself. Okay, so the getters are basically, well, getters. Sometimes we need to, sometimes we need to get state or filter something, and we usually go with getters because Vue will cache the results, which is basically how the computed props work. And the mutation types, so we go with constants because it's very easy to have typos, and it's also the recommended way in the official documentation. So the pattern we should follow is basically the same we had before, but now with Vuex. Our main application will access the store usually through map actions or map state and map getters, and the data will be provided down to the child components. And if we need the child components to handle events, then we will emit those events up. And the main app should be responsible to call the actions in the store. And usually we include the store in the main app itself because this also makes tests a lot easier. Like you can import the application and you already have the store there. By having child components not accessing directly to the store, it also makes the tests for those child components a lot easier because you don't need to set up a store and mocking the state. You just need to provide the properties down. So this is the reason why we have an inconsistent code base, because we were moving always along the way. We never actually stop and say, let's refactor everything that we already did into Vue, or because we never stop shipping new features. So this is the pattern you should be following. If If you are looking into a file that does not have UX, then you should not follow that pattern. And if you are looking into a file or an application that does not follow this or has the child components knowing too much about the store, then you should also not be following that pattern, but the documented one. And then we have a view shared folder. I'm sure that all of you have noticed that. And we have a GitLab UI, which is meant to be a UI library. So GitLab UI grabs Vue Bootstrap and has some of our shared components. And the reason we have these two different ways of doing it is because, again, we never stop shipping features. So by the time we realized we had a lot of repeated components, we started the Vue shared folder, we moved some things there. We still have the buttons and the drop downs and all the UI components would still be repeated. So in the meanwhile, we started GitLab UI, which is still a work in progress. The goal is to have everything into GitLab UI. So if you are starting a deliverable and you see that you have a component that does not exist and most likely it will be used somewhere else, then that component should be created in GitLab UI directly and not in the Vue shared folder. Phil, on to you.
So relatively new, I guess, we have GraphQL. It was added a while back, and the idea was that we'd start to convert the merge request widget into it, but we never actually got around to it. So there's currently one actual app that's using GraphQL, and it's the issue suggestions. But I would ideally suggest that everybody starts using GraphQL for new features. It would be great if literally every new feature is GraphQL. I mean, it might not be possible for some features, but please try your best to use it. For queries and mutations, we can write them in .graphql files. Webpack will compile them, so some get compiled on the front end, and we can import them into JavaScript or Vue files. If you're using a Vue app, we have Vue Apollo, so you can use the query component or the mutation component, and it can all just be done in the template, where you can like tweak it a little bit in the script part of it. If you're not using a Vue app, you can just directly import the Apollo client, and that should be a link to the actual Apollo client file, and you can just issue the queries and mutations through that. And if you need any local state, please use Apollo link state. This was brought up by Natalia. It's something that I hadn't even thought about. So please use Apollo link state, and you can try it on gitlab.com there. There's not very many queries there to do, but it should give you a rough idea. For our tests, I've not really listed all the tests here. There are a few more, like we have RSpec, which are end-to-end tests, and they take the application from sign-in all the way through to actually testing the application. You've probably noticed some failures if you're working on some of the tests. They're relatively simple to understand. It's just a case of finding a button and clicking them. And for the front end specifically, the Calm is the older one, and they all run in the same browser window, so some tests can interact with other tests in ways that aren't very nice, and you'll see failures that just make no sense at all. And then we have all an old view mount method. It looks a little weird, and there's maybe like 4 or 5 in the same file. There's like a create component, a mount component with store, create component with store. Ideally, we should be using Vue test utils, which is, again, it's been added relatively new. So for newer tests, please use Vue test utils, and ideally use Jest. With Vue apps, we can use .toMatch snapshot instead of just querying the elements and checking it exists. It'll write a snapshot file, just check that into Git and push that up as well. So, yeah, back to you, Filipa.
Thanks. Okay, so these last 2 slides are not about the code base itself, but how do we work regarding deliverables. So our deliverables are always features. They are always big, and they always have UX and front end and back end. And it can be a bit daunting if you are new and you have so many things to do in a deliverable. And sometimes it's easy to forget that we always aim for boring solutions, and that we rather ship something working than not shipping anything at all. So The advice is when you get assigned to a deliverable, check the UX mockups and identify the smaller components. So check if they already exist in either GitLab UI or if the view shared folder, or if you are unable to find them or are uncertain, ask a maintainer or anyone. I think anyone that is at GitLab over than like 6 months would be able to help, but to be sure you can ask a maintainer. You will most likely need a Vuex store. So the advice is first identify all the state properties, and with this you should write a spec, either in the issue or if you want to open an empty merge request, explaining which components do you need to create for your deliverable, which components may need to access the store besides the view application, what is the state, what is the hierarchy of the components, and what actions and mutations would you need. And before start writing any code, you should get validation from a maintainer on this plan, because sometimes it happens that someone is writing code for 2 or 3 weeks just to get to the review phase and realize that they need to rewrite everything again because it's not up to date with our patterns. So this planning step should happen. It's recommended that happens in the first week. And we also advise, like if you have smaller components that you need to create, to break them into smaller merge requests. So instead of having just one huge merge request with a lot of changes, ship things smaller, because maybe you have a new component that needs to go into GitLab UI, or a new component that needs to go in GitLab CE and maybe be reusable by anyone else in the same milestone. So that way we keep focusing on the boring feature, on the boring solutions and shipping fast. And regarding the review process, it's always helpful to keep in mind that all merge requests need to be with the maintainer by the first. If this does not happen, it's very hard to guarantee that your merge request will be merged within that release. It's also very important that if your merge request is changing anything in the UI, it needs to be reviewed by the UX person that is assigned to the issue. I'd recommend to do this step before the front-end review, because usually UX will ask for some change, which means that there will be code changes. So to avoid a lot of back and forth, I would recommend to start by the UX review and then move to the front-end review. And just a couple more advices before considering assigning to a maintainer or a reviewer is take the time to read the code yourself. Make sure that the pipeline is green, that all the discussions are resolved. And if a reviewer or a maintainer open the discussion, please don't dismiss it by asking another maintainer or another reviewer to review it before the first maintainer got the chance to follow up on that discussion. Okay, let me stop sharing and let's go into questions.
Yeah, so I guess I joined GitLab recently. Oh, by the way, thanks for putting all this together. So I guess where I was always a little bit confused coming from React and Redux was, in your experience, when is it appropriate to use emitted events? Is it something that should ideally be used from a component that doesn't have access to the Vuex store? Could it be used in components that do use the Vuex store? Yeah, do you mind clarifying that a bit? Because I guess that's where I was always not 100% clear on its proper usage.
Okay, let me just say sorry about the noise. It's not exciting. It's very annoying every time this, like every year this happens. There's a university near, and there's like the freshmen there doing stupid things. So regarding your question, Fernando, so in Vue, it's a bit different than React. In Vue, the communication is props go down, events go up. And when you add Vuex, it's exactly the same. The data goes down and the events go up. So if you have a button that is a child component, that button should emit an event, and the main app would listen to it and then call the action. Obviously, you can include the store everywhere, but that would make things harder to test and to reuse. So if we have smaller components using the store, and this has happened in the past, it's a lot harder than in the next milestone to realize, well, we need this, but this is already accessing the store for another app, and we don't have time to refactor this now, so let's just create a new component. So this is basically the two main reasons why we advise to not have all the child components accessing the store. Obviously, there will be exceptions. Sometimes it makes more sense for the child component to access the store directly, but I think a good rule of thumb is emit the events app until the main application.
So yeah, so thanks for explaining. As a follow-up question, does that mean emit the events up, but then handle them at the first component that has access to the store to then dispatch an action? Or does it bubble all the way up to the main app? Or?
Well, I would say that ideally only the main app would have access to the store, and we should not have, I can't remember of an application that has that many nested components. It could happen though, but I guess it also depends on each application. Sometimes it may make sense to keep bubbling them up if we have like a component in the middle that already knows about the store, then we can use it.
Okay, thanks. And sorry, and then the follow-up question was, I guess this is probably a side effect of being new to GitLab. Do we have like standard terminology for a component that has Vuex state and doesn't? Because I've heard things, yeah, I mean, I don't know, like,
no.
It seems like 3 or 4 different ways. So it seems like an easy thing to resolve, but I was hoping that maybe since we have everyone here, I could probably open up a follow-up issue just for the sake of documentation in the future. If we're going with like Vuex or, you know, storeless component, I've heard container.
We usually just call them dumb and smart components, but there was also a blog post saying that was not politically correct. So maybe we should document a better way of naming them.
Cool, cool. I guess I'll open up a follow-up issue. I mean, it should be easy to resolve, but thanks. That's all I really had.
I have a question regarding stores, because I've seen everything that we sometimes create stores in the index.js. Sometimes we create stores somewhere in the middle. Sometimes we create stores in the component, like in the root component or something. But my main question is, would it be okay to have because sometimes we have a create store function, because it's also easier for testing, similar to the state function. Would it be okay to give this create store function parameters? So for example, one use case I would have, we have in Secure, we often use view action just to set something in the state, like an API endpoint that never changes during the runtime of the app. And it would be just easier to plug it in directly rather than piping it through the Vue app to the Vuex store, like providing it directly, for example, in the index.js when we read the API endpoint from.
I'd say no, because you would have to have the store in the index and not the main app, and then you would have to mount the store in the tests, and that would not actually. We don't have good end-to-end tests, and if we start moving things out of the main component, and then if you look into our tests, you will see a lot of things that are not actually testing our code. They are mocked. So we would have to mock the store with the parameters that we are providing. So I'm pretty sure that it would happen that we would have code in production without an endpoint, for example, and we would have tests for it. There just not be testing the whole flow. So, and also, let me just, sorry, let me just finish. Also, if we start doing that, we will have one more pattern, and we already have so many. It's not that costly to provide the endpoint as a property to the main application. So I'm not sure if it's helpful if we have one more pattern.
So the actual problem I was hitting, and I'm just opening the issue because we're out of time already. The actual problem I was hitting, that the store was created and was already doing requests before it had the API endpoint, because the app was not mounted and wasn't providing it down to the app. So anyway, I will look into it and create an issue around it.
Thanks. We are already over the hour, but if you have any more questions, we can do it async on the front-end channel or open issues about it, or in the next front-end call. I hope you all have a good day.